Thank you to the Simons Institute, who is having us for the second time already take over their beautiful institution. And so I want to thank the staff here who has done an amazing work bringing all of you here together. And now you're ready.
Yeah.
Yes, let's go.
Okay. I suffer so. Thanks. I just want to point out, I'm not an AI person. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a computer scientist. I do some applied math, and I do a lot of neuroscience and computational neuroscience. And I have no idea why Shiri made me the first speaker. I think she was trying to find the most ignorant person she could to like lower the bar enough that nobody else would feel bad about their talk. So today, in the first part of the talk, I'm going to talk about a really, I think, neat, very long line of research that we've been doing on human navigation, because that's the closest thing that my lab has done to something that is relevant to the world models topic. It's also relevant to the social cognition topic, as for weird reasons. And in the second part of the talk, I'll talk about world models and neuroscience and my depressing experience of thinking about them in the context of neuroscience, because it's not pretty. So you probably saw we had a spinny brain at the beginning of this slide, and it's very inconvenient to have a brain folded up inside the head, so we kind of inflate it computationally and then flatten it out like a large pizza. And then we can map brain activity on the surface of the brain. In this case, we're measuring brain activity with MRI, which is measuring metabolism, not neural activity. It's a bulk metabolic signal. And we just have people in this MRI machine, and they're basically doing an Uber driver task. They learn this large environment. It's a couple kilometers on a side. There's 200 landmarks they have to learn. It takes them about 10 hours of driving around to learn the environment. And they just get a little command up, like drive to the grocery store, and then they have to navigate to the grocery store. And there's other traffic, and there's people, and there's weather, and all kinds of stuff. So this is by far the most naturalistic experiment anybody's done in the MRI machine. And it's absolutely insane, and I wouldn't recommend anybody else do it. You can see as this person's driving, I mean, right now they're sitting, and so a lot of what you're seeing in the brain is activity in what is known as the default mode network, which is basically the rumination network. It's part of your brain that's talking to yourself all the time, especially when you're not doing an externally directed task. But you can also see that if the traffic ever moves here, you'll see that when the person turns left, you see motor activity. When they turn right, you see motor activity. They're looking at traffic signs. Man, this is the most boring video ever. When they see traffic signs, you'll see that they're looking over at traffic signs, and you'll see activity related to that. All kinds of complicated things are going on in the brain. And of course, as they're driving through the world and doing this task, everything that's happening in the world has to be reflected in the brain activity. All of the planning that they're doing has to be reflected in brain activity. You know, we're not dualists, right? Everything that is involved in this task has to be somehow reflected across this complicated neural network. And for those of you who aren't brain people, we're only looking at the cerebral cortex here, not the subcortical nuclei, not the cerebellum. There are probably something on the order of 200 to 300 distinct, functionally distinct, anatomically distinct regions on the cerebral cortex. And each one of those is going to be a layer in some very highly connected feed-forward, feedback neural network. So my job in my lab is just to figure out how the stuff in the brain relates to the stuff in the world and the task. That's basically what we do. Now, there is some stuff that's known about the human brain and navigation. This is aggregating 30 years of studies in human navigation system. There are some broad regions that are known that are particularly involved in navigation: the parietal cortex, motor cortex, hippocampus, and these three areas you'll hear about all the time if you're in the navigation world for humans: the occipital place area, the parahippocampal place area, and the retrosplenial cortex, that represent different aspects of navigation-related information. But all these experiments that get this data are really reduced. For example, you'll show somebody a picture and ask them to mentally navigate to a place in the picture. Or you show them two pictures and ask them which are they the same location or different location if they're taken from different viewpoints, right? Things like that. So we wanted to do a real navigation experiment, which is why we developed this. We've got this giant world. It's a virtual world. It's done in Unreal Engine. And then we've got somebody lying in the MRI machine, and our first money for this experiment actually came from Ford. We originally made a little magnet-safe game controller. Ford complained that they needed a steering wheel, so we built a little magnet-safe steering wheel and pedals. So this person is really driving in the MRI machine. They got a bunch of optics, they're steering, they're pedaling. It's as close as you can get to driving if you could drive while lying down, right? Which I do. I put my seat way back, but all right. So they're driving around. They go to the grocery store. They get a command, go to the grocery store. They drive there. And then they get another command, go somewhere else. And that's all they do. They do this for a couple hours in the MRI machine. And we collect brain activity data. We're collecting measurements every 1 or 2 seconds. This is just behavioral data to show that they can actually do the task. This is a straightforward task on a road network, so you can compute the optimal path, and you can find out that in most cases after training, people take the optimal path, or they take a path that's equivalent to the optimal path. They're very, very good at this task. They do learn it. One of our subjects never learned the task, even after 10 or 15 hours of navigating, and they were dropped. They would be a fascinating person to look at in a different study, but their data is not included here. Now, when we do experiments in my lab, I tend to take kind of a scorched earth approach. I don't like testing one hypothesis because my working assumption is all hypotheses are wrong and all models are wrong. And I would rather have the biggest chance of getting a hit, getting something that's right. Because the problem with deductive science is the minute your hypothesis is wrong, there are no rules about how you do induction to get another hypothesis, right? So what we did is we did a literature review of the entire navigation literature for rodents, primates, and humans, and we came up with about 38 different hypotheses about what kind of navigation-related information might be represented somewhere in the brain. And this literature goes back 50 years. This is basically every theory everybody has had about what information might be represented in the brain for navigation. I want to point out, since this is a world models course, none of these hypotheses have to do with world models. And that's because the whole field of kind of psychology and historically neurophysiology has kind of a filtering linear systems kind of bias towards it, where the idea is you get some information, you shove it through some filters, and then you make a decision on the filtered output. And that kind of very traditional engineering point of view is just embedded really, really heavily in all the experiments that everybody does in this field. There are a few efforts people have taken to bring in control theory, like model predictive control kinds of experiments into the literature, but they're nascent. We've got some work on that, but I can't remember if I included the slides. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about these hypotheses and these the representations that we are testing to examining to look at these hypotheses, and I'll get to the world model stuff at the end. Okay, so what do we have? We have some brain data. We have to map this into a hypothesis. So the easy way to do this in neurophysiology or MRI is you assume that your system is an NL system. There's a nonlinear system and then a linear system. You can do that as long as your system's stationary. And people aren't learning in this environment, so we can reasonably safely assume that we're dealing with a stationary system here. So the reason you want to divide it into an NL system is you take your stimulus and your task and you nonlinearly map it into some feature space that reflects a hypothesis about some information that's represented in the brain. And then you can do linear regression to map that feature space onto the brain. And since linear regression is that L stage is just going to be some sort of rotation of the coordinate system, you're not going to lose any information. So we take the stimuli, we map it into, in this case, about 38 different feature spaces, all reflecting different aspects of information that might be represented in the brain. And then we do linear regression to map it onto the brain. And we're good data scientists, so we always are very, very careful about separating our fit and test data sets, and we don't overfit. And then once we get our brain models for each point in the brain, we're going to have a very complicated model. Then we can go to the interpretation phase and try to understand how those different representations are represented across the brain. So this makes all the assumptions about the models explicit, permits complicated use of complicated stimuli, gives us functional maps in each and every subject, gives us statistical significance and prediction accuracy and generalization, but it does require a lot of data. It's a very data-intense method. But this is the most sensitive method that we have in MRI to model the brain data. So we have all the ground truth information because this is a video game. So we know where all the surfaces are. We know the distance. We have the depth map. We have all the ground truth. We know the task the person is performing because we gave them the task. We told them where to go. So we have a lot of data that we can use to create these feature spaces. So this just shows you the feature spaces that we have. Gaze grid, eye tracking, low-level vision feature spaces, a bunch of feature spaces that have to do with tracking progress, goal-related features, path integration features, because there's a bunch of path integration theories in the navigation literature, a bunch of high-level vision representations that we're going to search for, a bunch of cognitive maps, and some motor information. So we're going to fit models to recover all of this information from the experiment in one fell swoop. So to do that, we are essentially representing each of these feature spaces as a bunch of filters in some form. So for example, to calculate the route time, the time that you've elapsed on the route, we bin it, and we have 43 features, and this gives us the fraction of the total time to destination encoded by a set of indicator variables. So you can see how this just basically translates all of these complicated theoretical feature spaces into essentially filtering operations you perform on the task. And in this study, we're basically fitting 20,000 features to each and every voxel. A voxel is a little three-dimensional cube that we're measuring in the brain, and we're getting about 60,000 voxels across the cortex. So this is why I own a lot of computers. So if we just look to see how well these 38 encoding models fit the brain, you can see that there's a lot of regions of the brain that are well fit by this model, particularly the visual system, the motor system, parietal cortex, which is doing a lot of coordinate transformations from eye-centered coordinates into hand-centered coordinates, and planning regions in the prefrontal cortex. And through a long, complicated series of maneuvers that I'm not going to explain, we recovered 11 navigation-related regions of interest from this experiment. This is excluding the generic motor and vision areas because they do a lot of stuff that's not just navigation. So we find that there's 11 of these specific navigation-related areas across the brain that are all involved in processing some different aspect of this task. And now you can look at each of these 11 navigation-related regions, and you can determine exactly what kind of visual, motor, and cognitive planning information it's represented in each region. And this is the most complicated graph ever made, so I'm going to walk through a little bit. We got 38 feature spaces, which is way more data than any human wants to think about. You can divide them into like high-level vision, cognitive map, high-level vision, and motor. High-level vision is kind of orange, motor is green, route progression. Excuse me, that doesn't say route progression. God, I can't even see what that, path integration. Path integration is blue, so the cognitive variables are blue and pink. Right. So if you...
clarification question.
Yes.
These feature spaces, these are presumably features that you compute from the video input?
Yes, or the task.
Or the task.
Right, or the behavior. So for example...
But in some sense, you are magically assuming that knowledge, that state knowledge and so forth.
The model does, right. So imagine, so for example, route progression, right? There's probably somewhere in your brain that knows how far you've traveled. So you have to decide how you want to represent that, how you want to operationalize that in your experiment. In this particular case, we know the path you've traveled, and we know exactly how long it took you to travel that path. So we can instantiate two variables, one that reflects the distance and one that reflects the time, for example, because we can recover that from the data set.
For each of those features, you have a separate encoder trying to encode the fMRI into this feature?
Yeah. So again, this goes back to, I know it's overwhelming, trust me. You think you guys are having a bad time, just imagine the poor reviewers who had to review this paper. All right, so here's the 38 feature spaces, right? So let's just take one randomly. So there's a theory that the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus are only engaged during navigational choices. So that that suggests that the entorhinal and hippocampus activity will be predictable during taxi driving, but not passive viewing or guided navigation, right? So now we have this theory. Now we have to instantiate that as a feature space. Yes.
Which is the input and which is the output? The features are the output and the input is the fMRI, or vice versa?
Oh man, but this is, this is a 20-minute talk. So
Sorry.
I can talk for 8 hours. I'm a professor, but I'm not sure you want that. Okay. We got our task. We got our brain activity. We're going to map the brain. We're going to map the task and stimulus variables into these different feature spaces, right? So there's a bunch of retinotopic features, motion energy features, the semantic segmentation of the scene, cars, where the cars are, where the buildings are, and so on. We've got a bunch of route progression features. And that can be represented different ways because there are different theories about how route progression is represented. So you can represent it as a bunch of phase-encoded variables or indicator variables. There's a feature space that is a grid cell feature space because there's a theory that there are grid cells, so there should be a hexagonal representation, right? All those different feature spaces are in here. They're all built in here. And for every single one of them, what we're going to do is we've translated nonlinearly into some feature space, and now we do linear regression onto the brain. We're not doing decoding here. You could. It's a whole other paper on decoding. But decoding and encoding are symmetric. They don't really, they provide the same information just in ways that are differentially opaque. And you might want to use them or not, depending on your point of view. Okay, so the bottom line here is the cognitive variables tend to be purple and blue. The motor-related variables here are green. The vision variables are orange. That's really all you have to know, okay? So you notice in these navigation-related areas, like RSC and PPA, they tend to be very vision-dominated. This OPA, which is another navigation-related area, seems to divide between the cognitive, motor, and vision variables. If you go down here to V1, it's dominated by vision. You go down to motor, it's dominated by motor, as you'd expect. And as you go through this network, if you look at hippocampus, it's all abstract navigation stuff, nothing directly related to vision or motor. And if you go through this network, what you'll see is this slow transformation from perceptual information through cognitive information to motor information, just like any other neural network that you would fit to do navigation, right? And these things are incredibly redundant with each other. I should mention that this map is not actually what these areas represent. This map is the differences between what these areas represent and the brain on average. So there's actually enormous correlations between the representations in these areas. All right. Okay, so since this is Simon's meeting, and that gives you a chance to think about things you don't usually think about, in preparation for this meeting, I went and did a giant literature review on world models. I've been, for the last several months, architecting the ultimate literature review agent that goes out in the world and finds papers and summarizes them and makes a nice little chart for me. And so this kind of shows the bot's view of different sort of views on world models, the compression view, which is the old Barlow idea, Atneve and Barlow, a control theory point of view, a world simulation point of view, cognitive map point of view, and so on. But interestingly, one of the kind of big distinctions that the bot noticed in the literature was this distinction that I'm sure a lot of you who are working with neural networks are thinking about in terms of world models, which is what is being really represented in my world model? Is it a generative model of the world, or is it just picking up on stimulus correlations? And I don't think you guys, as far as I can tell, in the literature have figured out the answer to that yet. I'm not sure anybody knows. This is also a big, I should mention that this whole issue about so let me take a step back since nobody's given a talk on world models yet. So for those of you who aren't world model people, the issue for the world, this is my take on world models, which is the brain just picking up on correlations and just predicting the next state of the world based on the correlational structure of the world, which is how I was brought up as a little kid to think about the brain? Or is the brain actually instantiating some underlying model of the causes of the events that occur in the world that is a really low-dimensional, highly compressed, highly efficient representation of the actual structure of the world. And then from that, it derives these probabilistic relationships. That's essentially the difference we're talking about, as far as I can tell. So I got one thumbs up. Okay, fine. So my take on this from looking through all the neurobiology literature is nobody knows, and the evidence sucks. Nobody has any idea in the brain which of these two groups of theories is true, and it's really, really a horror show of just really sad, vague results. And I do not blame the world model people for this. I blame the brain. The brain is annoying. It's really complicated, and it lives in a really complicated world. And so I just want to, in the last few minutes here, I have no idea how long I've been talking. I'm not actually that far over time. In the last few minutes, I'm just going to mention a few things that are problems that have to be solved if you're going to try to test to see if there's world models in the brain. I have 10 more minutes? I thought I only had 20 minutes.
30.
Oh, well, in that case, no problem. Let me bloviate for a while longer. All right. So I thought I had 20 minutes. Okay, so the first is, all this stuff's going to be really obvious to people. The world is highly correlated with itself. So these are the 38 feature spaces that we have in this particular experiment. Remember, these are all the feature spaces. These are all the features that anybody has ever theorized might be represented in the brain that are related to navigation, right? This is pretty much every one. It's an exhaustive list. And you can see that there's substantial correlations between these features. And these correlations are really annoying because most of our regression methods and our modeling methods can't deal with these correlations. Ordinary least squares completely falls apart if you have these correlations. Now, because people have been working on regression for a really long time, and we in particular have been working on this problem for 30 years, we have regression methods that allow us in the brain data to decorrelate all this and to get pretty good representations of each of these variables independent of the other variables. But this is a long slog to get over to this state. And just dealing with the variables themselves is really hard, and pretty much every analysis method you're going to use to try to understand the brain is going to have to somehow deal with these correlations. And most people don't. Most people completely ignore the correlations because it's hard, and humans are lazy. We're all lazy. All right. The second problem that we have to deal with is that these brain representations are correlated with all the other brain representations. This is just like one of the real strong similarities between the brain and artificial neural networks is that the difference in the information that's represented between successive layers of this network is really quite small. And so if we have, say, 20 layers of processing between the primary visual cortex and primary motor cortex, there's going to be very small shifts across that network. One of the things that Tian Zhao did, I didn't mention, I should have at the very beginning, all of this work that I'm talking about today was done by one graduate student postdoc, Tian Zhao Zhang, who's basically been working on this for 10 years. So this shows a kind of embedding approach to trying to understand these representations. So what we have is each voxel is now a vector in this 20,000 dimensional feature space. And so you can take all of these vectors for your 60,000 voxels, and you can put them through some hideously complicated nonlinear embedding method like UMAP just to try to interpret what's going on. And if you do that, you take a low-dimensional UMAP embedding, you get something that looks like this. And what you'll see is that the areas are all they're distributed across a gradient, but they're also very, very highly overlapping. And this kind of low-dimensional projection of this giant hideous manifold really has two dimensions, abstract versus concrete information and vision versus motor information. Those make intuitive sense, right? But if you look at the individual areas, they all hugely overlap. So the brain areas themselves are really, really correlated with each other. And making statements about, one brain area does A and one brain area does B is usually a fool's errand. That just makes things hideously complicated to deal with. The third is that there are signals related to attention everywhere in the brain. Attention, when I grew up in psychology, we always thought of attention as a little box, like you do some stuff and then you shove it into the attention box and then you do some more stuff. It's a really nice, easy way to think about the brain. But unfortunately, attention is the control system that routes information around the brain all the time, dynamically, and it's constantly changing the way information is represented in the brain. So, for example, if you have somebody just watch movies that have cars in them and things moving around, and then you have them actually drive in the MRI machine, and you map the semantic information, visual semantics, onto the brain, what you'll find is the way visual semantic information, which is like the dumbest kind of information, the way that's represented in the brain is completely different in those two situations. In particular, what happens is, during driving, a bunch of brain areas that you wouldn't think would represent driving-related information, all of a sudden do. For example, if you have somebody just watch movies and there are people and cars in the movies, what'll happen is there's a bunch of social-related regions in the brain. The one you guys have all heard about is this FFA, the fusiform face area. And the FFA will respond to people, but it won't respond to cars. But now if you're driving and there are other cars in the environment, all of a sudden FFA now responds to cars. Why? Well, presumably because now the cars are agents. And they have a mind, and therefore you have to have a theory of mind about these other inanimate objects, the cars in this virtual world. You can't see anybody in them. The windows are opaque, so they're just boxes moving around. But because you can't run into the agents and you have to negotiate with them behaviorally, now all of the basically social network becomes selective for vehicles when it wasn't before. And the other big switch you see when you're doing navigation is that things like road signs, affordances, which are what can you drive on, all those aspects of the world become hugely represented throughout the whole brain, and a bunch of the other visual information that's irrelevant, like buildings, it basically gets downweighted. So all of the regions shift their tuning to maximize the representation of behaviorally relevant stimuli. And this is a thing we see all the time in brain data that nobody likes to think about because it makes the brain complicated, and the brain's complicated enough without thinking about how the brain is really complicated. Right. Another thing I think is a problem is that all of these like generative world model theories are correlated with other versions of world model theories that aren't world model theories, like the Bayesian brain theory or just simple predictive coding. In fact, a lot of people think about this as kind of a hierarchy where you have predictive coding, and then predictive coding lives in the context of Bayesianism, and then Bayesianism lives in the context of this world model kind of situation. But Bayes' theory is just a law of the universe. I mean, any system that actually works and optimally in the world has to kind of obey Bayes' theorem. So it's going to be really hard to find a situation where Bayes' theorem isn't a good model. And there are people who specialize in that. I once asked Tom Griffiths why he worked on the weird things he did, and he had this interesting response. He said, I just want to find out when people aren't Bayesian. I thought, oh, that's nice. That's a defined thing. It's probably interesting. I thought that was a good philosophy. Anyway, so all of these models are going to be correlated with one another. And having models correlated with one another is really a bad situation for both the theorist and the experimentalist, because most people don't do model comparison. They just test one model. But if your model's correlated with a bunch of other models and you are not testing the hinge point, the key part that's differentiating between those models, you're going to get a false positive. And finally, the last issue, which is maybe not a problem for you folks who are fortunate enough to work with artificial neural networks, but is a problem for all of us who work with real neural networks, is all of our measurements are at the implementation level. And all of the theories are usually pitched at the computational level. So you have to move across levels from the implementation to the theory. And in neurophysiology, this tends to be done in a very brute force kind of way, where different elements of, say, a Bayesian network are essentially proposed to relate to different connections in the canonical microcircuit of the brain. I personally don't like this just because it's not that it's dumb. I just feel like it's probably destined to fail, and I don't like going into an experiment knowing that I'm going to fail. It's too depressing. So this has been a lot of people have worked on this really, really hard. And it's been a mess. It's just really been a mess. Okay, so I think I'm at the end. So here's my suggestions for moving forward, because it would be interesting to really be able to evaluate whether world models are represented in the brain or not. And here's my suggestions for things people could do to make my life and maybe science better. and none of them are easy, unfortunately. The first is that theorists should focus on formulating specific predictions that discriminate their preferred model from other highly correlated competing theories. And in practice, this is likely to be very, very difficult, especially in the context of the natural world. And I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry for theorists that I know I'm telling you to do extra work, but look at the bright side, you're not doing experiments. So you don't have to sit in a lab all day. You can go out and sit by the pool and do this. That's okay. Given the indirect relationship between implemented neural circuits, the measurements of those circuits, and computational theories, then really what we need is we need the theorists and the experimentalists to work more closely together to try to figure out how these experimental variables are going to be reflected in the measurements we make. There have been a lot of recent MRI papers trying to look at predictive coding theories. That's a really fraught problem because MRI is a bulk measurement of metabolism. It can't distinguish between inhibitory and excitatory neurons. It can't distinguish if there's subpopulations of neurons inside a voxel. It's just total metabolic activity. So there's a lot of ambiguity about what that total metabolic activity means, and there are certain kinds of questions you can ask about that, like you can ask what information is encoded in this metabolic signal, or what information can I decode from the metabolic signal? That's a straightforward question. But asking questions about detailed synaptic weights and how they might change in different subpopulations of neurons is completely out of the question. Experimentalists seeking to test some specific theory should always pit multiple competing models against one another. Again, sadly, this is rarely done. I like testing multiple models against one another because I just assume that all models are wrong. But I don't have a theory about the brain. I'm a very data-driven guy. Most people who are smarter than me have a theory about the brain. And they aren't interested in showing that theory is wrong. They're interested in showing that theory is right. So they test that one theory, and then they show it's right. But they don't ever test any other theories. So if all the theories are correlated with one another, what have we really learned? I personally find that frustrating, but I'm not one of those guys. So people should always do model comparison. Always, 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 always test multiple models. And finally, the very fundamental differences between the architecture in the brain versus the architecture of artificial neural networks or large language models really has to be taken into account. I think it's perfectly fine to make analogies between artificial neural networks and brain networks. I do it all the time. It's incredibly useful. But the brain is very, very different from these artificial neural networks. It's really hardware constrained. There's not a lot of dynamics on the structural level, but there is a lot of dynamics on the functional level. And the representations are constantly being modulated as different subnetworks in the brain are being switched in and out. And different communication pathways are being opened and closed. That essentially changes the way that information is represented in areas that aggregate information. Okay, that's it. I think, did I finish in time then? Yeah, almost. Not bad. Okay. Jitendra.
Yes. So I think that we now have better tools that you could be using. I mean, it may be that fMRI is not the right data, but
MRI is never the right data.
No. My question is today that I think that instead of thinking of your pipelines and your procedures have been designed in a more traditional setup of these feed-forward perception kind of pathways. What we have to deal with here are control systems. And these are feedback control systems operating at a fairly high frame rate. I mean, when we make robots run, we kind of have to have them operating at 100 hertz and so on. I mean, so the important signal is the temporal changes, the error signals, the predictions that you make, the errors that correspond to the difference between the prediction and the actual stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when you look at my robots and the neural network which is driving my, for example, walking dog, that has all of that information. So my question for you is, if you want to develop a methodology, why don't you first just show it on the neural network for a working sensory motor control system such as a quadruped or whatever. And
I
if
am.
your,
We're
if your
bipeds.
methodology works there, then you can try it elsewhere. But my
I see.
fear is that that what will matter a lot is high frequency stuff, which you may be getting killed with in FMI.
Totally. So the comment was I think there was kind of two threads there. One is, hey, you're losing high frequency information, you suck, which is fine. And the second is that, control systems are really important. Why aren't I fitting an MPC model to this data set?
Correct.
And the first model, you're completely correct. This is MRI. There's no signal in MRI at a time scale faster than a second. There just isn't. We just can't recover that. There are no ways to get those kinds of data out of the brain at any high bit rate. For example, I can do MEG, I can do EEG, but the bit rate I get out of MRI is about 10 bits a second, and the bit rate I get out of those things is like a bit in 10 seconds. It's really a low bandwidth signal. So there's no free lunch here. The other thing I could do is I could do ECOG or neurophysiology, and then I'm going to get fantastic data, but only from a vanishingly small fraction of the neurons. So every method we have right now is either sacrificing space or time. There's just nothing to be done about it. One of the great things about this navigation experiment is it evolves kind of slowly over time, right? So it's a time scale that is more commensurate with MRI than a lot of other tasks we could pick. The second thing I'll just mention quite quickly is we actually have a whole paper on fitting MPC and OVM and some other control models to the brain data. And that's actually incredibly cool. It's a project I've been doing with Claire Tomlin because the best control theory model for behavior is not the best control theory model for the brain. And it's very, very counterintuitive. So you can fit an MPC model as a nonlinear model, just like anything else, and fit it to these data. But I'm happy to talk with you more about it later. Oh,
This is why we have breakout
Alyosha.
sessions. And you can do it then.
No, sorry, Alyosha.
Breakout later. Okay.
Yell at me later.
For the interest of time, I am happy to introduce Philip Isola from MIT. There is a coffee break right after you, so you can still take your 30 minutes, okay?
Okay, awesome. Okay, thank you for having me. Yeah,